short video. Yes, I promise this will be short, but really important, at least to me. In the past year of first debunking, then researching, then jumping the fence to the bizarre conclusion that the heliocentric model absolutely doesn't work in terms of physical experiments, repeatable observations, or any sort of tangible evidence you can possibly imagine, all of that contradicts the heliocentric model, which is the one where we live, stuck to the side of a spinning sphere, thanks to the theory of gravity and the theory of the Big Bang, just to name a few. The main purpose of this video is not necessarily to provide a working stationary plane model, but instead to make a few points which must be considered and personally verified by each person on an individual level. So many people have asked me, and I've often asked myself, is there a silver bullet, or what is the silver bullet, so to speak, that will instantly show a person that the heliocentric model actually doesn't work? There really is such a robust smorgasbord of evidence to choose from. It's often difficult deciding where to begin with a standard, well-educated person and presenting them, the most outlandish and bizarre theory imaginable in such a way that they will not deem you hypnotized, stupid, crazy, or some combination of those three. It is very bizarre considering the extremely nonsensical and indeed preposterous so-called pillars of the heliocentric model, including but not limited to curvature of the Earth's overall surface, making it a sphere, which is an assumption that is proven to be false. Another one would be axial rotation, meaning the north polar area spins at, well, half the speed as the hour hand on a clock, while the equator allegedly spins 1,037.5 miles per hour, with no sense of disparity in between the two positions, even though at the North Pole spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a clock, you would be parallel with the axis and on top of the axis. However, at the equator, while spinning 1,037.5 miles an hour, you'd be perpendicular to the axis, 4,000 miles away from the center of rotation, and zipping around a curve, vertically falling about 130 miles an hour at the equator. Yet, there's no sense of disparity of spinning, centrifugal force, gravity, that sort of thing between the North Pole and the equator. Now, gravity is another big one in terms of these assumptions that are allegedly responsible. Gravity is allegedly responsible for tethering the sun to the galactic center during its theoretical 250 million year cycle around the hypothetical Milky Way galaxy. Plus, gravity tethers the Earth and all of the other so-called planets theoretically to the sun, and even further, allegedly tethering the moon to the Earth in such a way that gravity is undetectable. One would imagine that with all of these complex operations of gravity and it being such a powerful and abundant force, traversing and penetrating all matter, space and time, you would think, would be just full of all sorts of evidence of gravity, and it would be detectable in a very tangible sense, especially when talking about nearby relationships involving our local celestial bodies such as the moon and the sun. Now, this is of course not the case, and only within the last few weeks or months, maybe, gravity waves have been conveniently, allegedly discovered by none other than LIGO, a group of scientists, and LIGO is some sort of interferometer device. It's the, quote, most precise measuring device ever built. But this group of scientists running LIGO, who just so happen to be very thirsty for grant money, they've convinced themselves, due to a blip on a chart, that they have found proof of gravity waves, as well as black holes, as well as binary black holes, as well as binary black holes merging into a single singularity, double positive, single singularity, but whatever. But all of these, very, very exciting and astounding discoveries by LIGO, because they interpreted a blip on a chart.
We have detected gravitational waves. They were detected by LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. LIGO is the most precise measuring device ever built. Let me start with what we saw. So on September 14th, 2015, Anna recorded a signal, and the signal had a very specific characteristic. The characteristic of, as time went forward, the frequency went up. And now it took us months of careful checking, rechecking, analysis, looking at every piece of data to make sure that what we saw was not something that wasn't a gravitational wave, but in fact it was a gravitational wave. And we've convinced ourselves. That's
the case, and we're here to announce that today.
By the way, this is not a Hollywood production that I'm going to show you. It is actually a real computer simulation, 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 a real computer simulation.
Talk about the gravitational waves. You didn't see any gravitational waves there. What you saw was actually the black holes. Now let me look at this from the gravitational wave perspective. So you're going to see again a computer simulation. This is a real simulation. So you're going to see again a computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation. A computer simulation. This is a real simulation.
Let me start with what we saw. So on September 14th, 2015, the two LIGO observatories in Hanford, Washington, and Livingston, Louisiana, recorded a signal nearly at the same time, nearly simultaneously, and the signal had a very specific characteristic. The characteristic of, as time went forward, the frequency went up.
And they made a very convincing CGI rendering of what the gullible scientists at LIGO concocted to lend credence to their very ambitious and flimsy evidence of so-called gravity waves no less than 1.3 billion years ago, ergo 1.3 billion light years away, and yet we can't detect any sort of gravity waves emanating from the galactic center or the sun or the moon. Yeah. Okay. So, for one thing, if, quote, gravity in an Einsteinian sense was such a well-known, proven fact, like what goes up must come down, which is, by the way, not debated, then why do we need multi-billion-dollar lie factories to produce pseudoscientific hyperbole masquerading as scientific proof of a thing so preposterous and unbelievable as gravity, yet is considered a known fact, as scientists have been frantically searching for the so-called gravity waves now that gravity in general has been 100% debunked? It is rather convenient, ironic, and laughable at once to the casual observer, and I hope that the lyrical embellishists responsible for the bogus claim with LIGO for proof of gravity from over 1.3 billion years ago will be remembered on the proper side of history, which is that of totally blind followers of the religion of scientism or a willful deceiver. Or possibly just a compartmentalized spokesperson who reads from a cue card, fully believing the utter nonsense being purported, or just maybe not even understanding it at all and just reading the cue card. But so this very elusive and inherently contradictory gravity, which has never been proven or observed, but only assumed to be the cause for must go down. However, gravity as an Einsteinian warping of theoretical space-time is debunked by so many factors it's almost impossible to mention them all. For one, the Earth is obviously a stationary plane, lacking all curvature and axial rotation, but even humoring the heliocentric model, things like gravity really don't explain the relationships between far-distant celestial bodies, connected by nothing more than the vacuum of space, and the undetectable, unfalsifiable theory of gravity. This leads to the further bizarre hypotheses of dark matter to explain away the impossibility of a heliocentric gravitic universe, and specifically certain galaxies, and the theoretical physicists are emotionally, mentally, and financially incapable of humoring what happens to be the truth as a hypothesis worthy of
scientific study and testing.
When the truth becomes incompatible with your belief system, then you will never consider the truth as an option and will always deem it as a nonsensical joke, exactly as we're all trained to do since we were children. People often ask me, what is your goal? What do you plan to do with this flat earth truth? It seems like all you want to do is talk about it, argue the points, and make videos about it. A lot of people find my work helpful and sensible, and others find my work garbage and a waste of time. Now, I would never be so naive to think that my approach to this topic would be loved by all, but at least I can try to do my best to spread this truth. Now, I see this ultimate truth as such an important topic to share with people because awareness of any issue is key. I've found, unfortunately so, that there is no sort of silver bullet that will instantly wake someone up to this topic. People are, for the most part, hardwired to reject this topic no matter what. And so the best that we can do is present evidence in a logical fashion and testimony in terms of how we as globers became globe earth skeptics and ultimately flat earth proponents, and how we came to the conclusions not by some illusion or hypnotism or leap of faith, but instead as an honest result of following the scientific method, which involves humoring theories to test their validity. And this is the very fundamental purpose of the scientific method to begin with. On the other hand, the end of that process, the end of the scientific method, is that we must ultimately cast aside theorem which do not adhere to observable reality. So if a theory is falsified by even a single experiment or observation, or especially multiple experiments and observations, then that theorem, there's no further reason to humor that theorem as possible because it has been falsified. Now, with that being said, and approaching the major topic of this video, the Flat Earth movement, so it's called in its current modern sense, is very much in its infancy, although there's a ton of really great information out there and so much verifiable evidence to reject the heliocentric model and ultimately see the truth for what it is. On the other hand, there's an equal amount, if not a greater extent, of poor information or even misinformation, which means we must all be wary of repeating things we've heard because we like the way it jives with our understanding. There are a great deal of lingering mysteries involved with the globe Earth heliocentric model, which are absolutely answered in the simplest possible terms when considered in a static plane model, least of which being the observation of what goes up must come down, as the premise of this observation being proof of, let alone exclusive to, or even possible on a spinning sphere, is so simply and naturally resolved when the world is considered in its true form, which is a stationary plane governed by the natural laws of density and buoyancy instead of the theoretical laws of, space, time, and gravity, both of which hinge upon the Earth being a spinning sphere, which it is not, and also hinge upon, other sort of theorems such as dark matter and that sort of thing. The point is, over the last year, especially in my personal experience, so many so-called proofs of a spinning sphere Earth have been completely debunked. And all of the traits of the world being exclusive to a spinning sphere are indeed possible on a stationary plane. So, in other words, these pillars of the spinning globe proof, like the Coriolis effect, or, what goes up must come down, for example, all of these so-called globe Earth proofs are totally doable on a stationary plane, circumnavigation being another one. All of this stuff is totally doable on a stationary plane, and yet for some reason people have been programmed into believing that these observations conditions are exclusive to a spinning sphere. I think what goes up must come down is the most laughable and preposterous of all. Now, there may be some perceived physical issues with some of the more widely known or widely quote unquote accepted flat Earth models, namely the central northern azimuthal equidistant projection sort of situation. However, I will mention that is not a model, it's a projection based on latitude and longitude lines, which have been sort of assumed since the 1500s, based on calculations in the north and assumptions in the south. Not to mention many going so far as to purport a dome in the sky as if it were a proven fact. So I think it's important to keep this conversation with our feet on the ground, both when discussing the heliocentric model as well as the flat Earth model, and let's at least attempt to keep, physical proofs or so-called proofs based on physical repeatable experiments, and leave the theorizing to the, philosophers. And there's no problem with philosophizing, but I think it's important to delineate between science and philosophy, which theoretical astrophysics is sort of a blending of the two. It's a blending of science and it's a blending of philosophy, which really does give scientists a bent or a bias in their conclusions and research. Now, I think it's important to consider all options, even including a dome in the sky. However, an astronomical plane is just as likely as a physical dome situation, and I think that there's good evidence to support that any dome-like tendency of our environment at its highest point above the ground probably involves something along the lines of an electromagnetic field or possibly a toroidal EM vortex, and with the magnetic vortex in the central north, lending credence to things like the North Pole Star and even Tesla's likening of the world to a giant capacitor plate, where the ionosphere is the other plate to make the connection. The point is, although the flat Earth proponents might not have a 100% working model, I think I might point out that the heliocentric model has been irreparably obliterated in terms of a working model, in many shapes and forms. Physical experiments, hypothetical experiments, and simple observations which contradict, falsify, and ultimately disprove the heliocentric hypothesis. The likes of NASA and the sci-fi mainstream media programming have done a very excellent job to convince the world at large that our little speck of a world is just some insignificant piece of dust orbiting an insignificant little sun, just one in a billion just in the galaxy, which the galaxy is just one in a billion in the universe, making our entire world and all of human history just about as insignificant as, a grain of sand on the beach. The religion of science, or scientism as a paradigm, has made sure to tout their philosophical belief system as factual and slant any esteemed scientific body towards arriving at conclusions to support their belief system and to support their model, whilst ignoring and even ridiculing evidence, experiments, and conclusions which falsify or contradict their model. This is not just some unsubstantiated claim, and even to this day, scientists find the idea of the Earth being central, special, or even significant somehow, quote, frightening. And it's that sort of ideology which has permeated the upper echelons of scientism as a paradigm, or science as a belief system, for apparently many hundreds of years. And I should just remind the viewer that science is a process to discern the truth based on honest, repeatable experiments. To put it in its, most basic form. Now, I'm sorry to say that while we think of the Dark Ages as some ignorant time in the past, we are, for all intents and purposes, living in a more complex yet insidious form of ignorance, just like the Dark Ages, or maybe misunderstandings just like the Dark Ages, because we're given the illusion of truth and enlightenment and understanding of the universe, so to speak, when most of, quote, science is indeed a cult of belief systems which are very much based in theory, conjecture, and basically exclusion of certain proofs or certain observations that fly in the face of their belief system and model. And at the same time, they, promote and lend credence to and provide scientific bravado for anything that happens to fall in line with their theory or philosophy or their model. Now, instead of just ensuring the population is ignorant by, for example, not teaching them to read in the Dark Ages, at least in Europe, in terms of the peasant classes, in modern times we're given a different sort of ignorance and a much more clever and maybe subtle form, which is far more effective than the former. Call the Dark Ages Ignorance 1.0, while the current society at large is at Ignorance Core i7. The ignorance that is tattooed onto or into our psyche at as young an age as possible is parroted by all authority figures in the matters of science or theoretical physics, and I have been guilty of this for the majority of my life, as I'm 35 and I've been only really looking at this whole thing skeptically for the last year. So, isn't it sort of amazing that we're taught the heliocentric model at a very young age? Any arguments we may have had against the heliocentric model then were sort of squashed by the authorities, and as adults, we never really take the time to skeptically scrutinize the topic again, and it's very, very important that we do. The whole Big Bang, heliocentric, spinning spherical Earth hypothesis is indeed very bizarre, outlandish, and wholly unbelievable as a model of the universe. However, they've achieved domination of our minds at such an early age. Any person with a modern education will adhere to the preposterous long before looking at the truth as an alternative. To be very honest, it's amazing to me that this conversation and debate have made so much headway over the past year or two. However, it's really no surprise given the freedom of information sharing on the internet. In several recent scenarios, globe Earth skeptics throughout history have been ridiculed and discredited, and eventually their names forgotten, and their research and their legacy buried by the scientifical pontificates who'd like to maintain the status quo of ignorance. Maybe one example would be Tesla, and another example would be Dr. Samuel Rowbotham, or the author of Zetetic. Now, I'm not claiming that Tesla was necessarily a flat earther, because he did speak of things like planets, although there are, if you really do research a lot of the things that he wrote about and a lot of the things that he said, it really comes into question whether or not Tesla may have at least hypothesized the Earth as a stationary plane. Again, that's just because of certain references that he's made. I would urge everyone to sort of research the many, many writings of Tesla. But thanks to the recent outpouring of knowledge, and by recent I mean within the last decade or two, towards entering the age of Aquarius, eerily enough, we find that all things are slowly being revealed. And the beast system, which has been amassing its armies and rallying its troops across the world for really several decades, is poised to strike the final blow on peaceful civilization as we know it. Now, the good thing is we, the honest, hardworking, average, normal people outnumber these sort of militant, global, lack of a better word, globalist groups, 100,000 to one. There is this sort of pre-programming where the majority of people, honest, hardworking people, are oblivious to the overall plan, which involve things like Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. But I strongly believe that if we can get this topic, the topic involving the very shape and nature of our world, seriously discussed in the mainstream, then there may be such a mass awakening of all sorts of people, we can have at least the start of the paradigm shift desperately needed to avoid another term of Obama 3.0, as in Hillary, or Bush 0.0, as in Trump, because both of these so-called candidates are exactly the same choice, and they're exactly the ones benefiting from the schemes which siphon wealth from the common people and fatten the pockets of the rich. When people realize that the spherical Earth is a lie and NASA's a lie, the Republican slash Democrat dichotomy is a lie, and the Federal Reserve as a federal institution is also a lie, any political candidate who doesn't run against the rotten and festering financial political system, which has ensured the Republic of America has become a nation in physical and moral and financial decline, and none of this is by accident, but by exact design. The very people who control the stock markets, boom and bust the value of homes using slick deals and default swaps, run our political system much as they've done since 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was created, and they are inherently responsible for things like the Great Depression, and they gained basically all of the country's wealth in that, and most recently, the 2008 bust of the housing market here in America, which essentially really didn't benefit anyone except for the banks that had uh, default swaps on those companies and those investments. So it's time for these crooks, all of them, to go. But we can never achieve such a mass unification against this beast system until we come together on common ground that can make a really profound impact, which is beyond the scope of anything we can really imagine. As crazy as this seems, the awakening has begun, and I see more and more people just sort of accepting the Earth as a plane as a self-evident fact. I spent a lot of time, trying to convince people that there's something to this, and now it's almost as if the tide is turning a little bit, where I'm seeing it appears as if people are sort of accepting this as a self-evident fact, because it really is sort of plain and obvious once you really do go through this process of scrutinizing the heliocentric model and comparing that with the flat Earth model. Now, this is very encouraging because we might be crossing a threshold of stages, which means this truth movement is poised to make major headway. Now, I implore all of the flat earthers out there to stand unified in our efforts and at least stand unified on the fundamentals. Now, for example, I'm sure we can all agree that the world isn't a spinning sphere, and beyond that, the burden of proof is truly on the conventional accepted model and the proponents of the heliocentric model to rebut. I want to really quickly thank all of my subscribers and all of the other dedicated truthers out there. If you honestly haven't looked into the flat earth, I implore you all to do so. Utilizing the scientific method to test a hypothesis will never harm you and can only lead you closer to the truth by the process of elimination, or possibly aligning with one model over the other. This topic is not a waste of time, and if you want a chance to actually beat the so-called globalists, this one card, this one key card, really is the last Jenga piece, or the key Jenga piece, to crumbling the rest of this sort of beast system, which is very much a facade, and which is very much theoretical physics, and ultimately the Big Bang Theory, evolution, the spinning sphere Earth, etc. These sorts of theories really all come crumbling down with some basic fundamental observation and a breaking of the programming that we've all been subjected to since we were toddlers and even before. So I find it unnecessary and irrelevant to produce a working flat Earth model, at least until the heliocentric team produces a working heliocentric model. Until they do this, we're sort of at a standstill, and only a cooperative series of real experiments will ever solve these fundamental questions. And I think it sort of goes without saying that any government agency, including NASA, or especially NASA, should be barred from any scientific inquiry, as they have shown throughout history to be completely untrustworthy and a poison to our collective understanding of our natural place in the universe, which appears to be a secondary feature of our massive, mysterious, wonderful stationary plane Earth. So, in other words, the universe as we know it is just a, mere feature of our magnificent world. So with that, God bless. And if you'd like to tithe and help out, my friend Majida runs a Christian youth group outreach camp in Pakistan. Check out sogs.com. It's SOGSS.com. It's shelterofgodssundayschool.com. It's very easy to navigate through, and even just a little bit helps. And of course, if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so via PayPal or via fan funding should you desire. Although it is not obligatory, it is much appreciated. And with that, God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.